Chapter 22 Giuseppe Garibaldi of A Treasure of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 22 Giuseppe Garibaldi. If George Washington was the father of his country, certainly Giuseppe Garibaldi could be called the father of Italian liberty. For this one patriot, almost single-handed, fomented and carried on the revolution that resulted in the birth of the Italian nation as it stands today. Giuseppe Garibaldi was born in the year 1807 in the town of Nice, and was the son of a sailor and sea captain named Domenico Garibaldi. It is probable that almost before he could walk, Giuseppe was familiar with the deck of his father's vessel, and it is certain that when a very young boy he showed an aptitude and desire for a seafaring life. His father, however, did not wish his son to be a sea captain like himself, but desired him to lead some life ashore, where he thought the boy's chances of advancement would be better. This plan, however, did not appeal to Giuseppe. The call of the sea was in him, and he determined to be a sailor like his father. When still a young boy, with one or two companions, he stole a fishing boat and put to sea in the Mediterranean, sailing to the eastward. His father soon gave chase, however, with a faster boat, and caught the would-be mariner off the coast of Monaco, returning with him to Nice. The boy's cruise itself was ended, but this incident convinced the father that his son was intended for the sea, and in a few months Giuseppe shipped as a cabin boy, and before long was making long voyages. He quickly showed that seafaring was his natural calling, for before he was 24 years old he had become the master of a vessel, showing at an early age a capacity for responsibility and an ability to command other men that marked him head and shoulders above his companions. But while engaged upon his voyages, Garibaldi was thinking a great deal about the unfortunate condition of Italy and the unhappiness of his countrymen. For at that time the Italians did not form one nation as they do today, but were grouped in a number of petty states that frequently warred against each other, and were themselves surrounded by more powerful enemies. The idea of making Italy one nation had not then occurred to the bulk of the people, but there was a band of secret revolutionists who were working for Young Italy, and Garibaldi, who was known to be in favor of a united Italy, soon met some of the members of this organization. The young skipper promptly became fired with the desire to aid the work of the revolutionists, and went to Marseilles, where he talked with the famous patriot Mazzini, also a young man who had been active in revolutionary circles, and was the chief organizer of the league called Young Italy. Mazzini's aim was to put an end to all the existing Italian governments and form an Italian republic that should extend from Sicily to the Alps. For his revolutionary activities he had been banished from his native country, and was carrying on his work to the best of his ability in Marseilles. Mazzini gave Garibaldi a cordial greeting, and enlisted his aid in the work of the revolutionists. They were planning a war against the King of Sardinia, whose name was Charles Albert. And while the patriots invaded Savoy, Garibaldi's mission was to go to Genoa and hatch a revolution in the fleet, where it was thought there were many sailors who would gladly fall in with the aims of Young Italy and lend their aid in overthrowing the existing governments. The plot failed, and Garibaldi was left stranded at Genoa, hunted by the soldiers and certain to meet his death in case he was captured. He disguised himself in the dress of a peasant and escaped to France, where a newspaper informed him that he had been named as an outcast from his native country and had been sentenced to death. There was nothing further for him to do at that time except to carry on his calling of a sea captain under an assumed name, and it was not long before he had shipped as a common seaman on a vessel sailing for South America, where for 2 years nothing further was heard of him. But his ardent nature found play in the new country to which he had come, and when the province of Rio Grande rose in revolution against the rule of the Brazilians, Garibaldi joined the rebels and made preparations to fight in this revolutionary cause. He secured a little fishing vessel, and with a few companions began to cruise as a privateer in the insurgent cause, going through many sea fights and many hardships and adventures in the behalf of the revolutionists. Finally he was shipwrecked, and only saved his life by his great skill at swimming, most of his companions drowning in the surf, where he was powerless to help them. The revolutionists gave him another ship, and he soon sailed away for further encounters with the enemy. While in the port of Laguna a new adventure befell him, for there he beheld the woman who was to become his wife. Her name was Anita Riberas, and according to the South American custom, her father had arranged a marriage for her with a man she did not love. When she met Garibaldi, she was struck with his fine and commanding appearance, and he, on his part, instantly fell in love with her, for she was a woman of great beauty and a keen and spirited mind. The result of this meeting was that Anita eloped with Garibaldi, sailing away with him on his vessel and marrying him a few days later when another port was reached. Anita not only was on board Garibaldi's vessel in a number of sea fights, but actually took part in them. On one occasion, we are told, she was knocked down by a gust of wind made by a cannon ball as it whizzed across the deck, but picking herself up, continued to fight by the side of the men. Garibaldi then organized a band of guerrilla cavalry, and his bride, dressed in man's clothes, rode by his side. It was while her husband was a captain of guerrillas that she bore him a son, and on many weary journeys the baby was carried in a sort of net cradle slung from her saddle. Garibaldi was now fighting for the freedom of Uruguay. It was at this time that Garibaldi formed the band of revolutionaries called the Italian Legion. They chose for their colors a flag on which a volcano was painted, with fire spouting from the crater against a background of black. And Garibaldi, at the head of his Italians, was a skillful and famous soldier, known everywhere in Uruguay and even in foreign countries. In the year 1848, the whole of northern Italy rose in arms against the Austrians, and the King of Sardinia, Charles Albert, was now fighting in a cause that seemed just to Garibaldi, who desired of all things to see the foreign control of great nations taken away from his country. At once he decided to enter the war, and sailed for Italy with the members of his legion. He chose for an emblem this time the colors that have since become the flag of Italy, a flag of red, white, and green, arranged like the French tricolor. He received a cold welcome from the King of Sardinia, for Charles Albert could not forgive his former revolutionary activities. But the king soon had reason to hate him even more than hitherto, for when with the Pope he made peace with Austria after his forces had been defeated, Garibaldi refused to recognize the compact, and with a small band of insurgents continued the fight until he fell ill with fever and was compelled to give up the struggle and allow his soldiers to return to their homes. He was determined, however, that Italy should never again recognize Austrian rule, and as soon as he had recovered from the fever he began what was called the People's War. Numbers of Italians flocked to his standard, and his cause was soon strengthened by an uprising in Rome, in which the Pope himself was driven from office, and a minister named Rossi was murdered. Garibaldi had hastened to Rome to be present at the declaration of the Roman Republic, of which Mazzini was to be president. As the Austrian and French forces were pursuing him, he organized a stubborn resistance, and furious fighting took place in the outskirts of the city and in the streets themselves. Soon it was evident that the revolutionists must give in and the city be taken. The only hope for the Republicans lay in their escaping to the mountains. The city surrendered finally without Garibaldi's consent, and with his band of red-shirted followers he fled into the country just as the French soldiers were pouring through the gates. His wife, dressed as a man, accompanied him. Then commenced a campaign filled with most bitter hardships and difficulties. At the beginning of his flight he had only 5,000 men, and these were quickly decreased in numbers by the hardships they were compelled to undergo and by many desertions that took place as a result. But Garibaldi persevered until he saw that it was useless to think of any further resistance at that time, and he then planned a flight to the coast. Fully 50,000 well-armed and organized men were in pursuit of him, and their ranks were added to daily by deserters from his own small force. At last all but 200 surrendered, and these, with Garibaldi at their head, seized a number of fishing vessels and put to sea, hoping to reach the friendly city of Venice. But the enemy's vessels were watching the coast, and soon a large fleet was in hot pursuit. Some of Garibaldi's vessels were captured and sunk, and the rest were compelled to land to escape the pursuing ships. All this time his faithful wife Anita had accompanied him, but the hardships they had undergone had proved too much for her. She had fallen ill, and now it was seen that she had only a few hours to live. With soldiers of the enemy following him, and with his dying wife in his arms, Garibaldi hid among the sand dunes of the coast, and at last carried his wife into a deserted cottage, where she promptly breathed her last. With the soldiers at his heels, Garibaldi could not even wait to see her buried. He took to the hills once more, and after a terrible journey of 40 days, in which he was obliged to travel in disguise, he escaped on a fishing boat, and after being turned away from several ports where his presence was unwelcome, made his way to America. This time he went to New York, and for a time earned his daily bread as a ship chandler on Staten Island. Then he returned to his old trade of sea captain and sailed for China in command of a vessel called the Carmen. He then returned to Europe, and as the hatreds of the Revolution had now largely blown over, he was able to go to Nice and see his children. The search for him had waned. Italy seemed hopelessly under the yoke of her enemies, and Garibaldi settled down to private life on the island of Caprera, where he lived simply as a farmer. He was only too ready, however, to respond if another demand should come for him to carry arms in behalf of united Italy, and, through the skill of the statesman Cavour, such a demand did come in the year 1859. Cavour, by clever diplomacy, had brought on a war between the Austrians and the French, and with the aid of the powerful nation of France, the Italians were victorious at the battles of Magenta and Solferino. But while France was willing to fight the Austrians, the French were unwilling to have Italy at their doors as a united nation, and a peace was agreed upon between the two great powers, in which Italian liberty was ignored. All the work of Garibaldi seemed to have been useless. All of his great sacrifices were apparently thrown away by the statesmen and diplomats, who were forced to accede to the French and Austrian terms. But the Peace of Villafranca, as this agreement was called, was only the beginning of Garibaldi's greatness. He hastened to Genoa, where with 1,070 followers he seized 2 steamers and embarked for Sicily. Sicily had revolted on hearing of the peace terms, and Garibaldi had been invited to go there and aid the revolution. After a voyage of 6 days he landed at Marsala, where a tremendous welcome was given to him. The Neapolitan fleet was not far off, but they did not dare to open fire on the little band of revolutionists on account of British warships nearby, as Great Britain was known to favor the revolutionary cause. With Garibaldi at the head of an indomitable little army, the Neapolitan soldiers were put to flight at the Battle of Calatafimi, and Garibaldi advanced upon the city of Palermo. After heavy fighting, the city was taken, and afterward, at the head of about 2,000 men, Garibaldi routed an army more than 3 times the size of his own. All Sicily was soon in Garibaldi's possession. And now, with a considerable army at his back, he crossed over to the Italian mainland and advanced northward, with his enemies fleeing before him. Finally, he captured the city of Naples, and his work was completed. Without any hesitation, Garibaldi turned over his conquests to King Victor Emmanuel of Sardinia, who, after Garibaldi's successes, had marched against Naples, and was now in control of a large part of the Italian peninsula. After refusing many rewards, Garibaldi retired again to the island of Caprera, but in 1862 he raised a volunteer army and marched against Rome in an attempt to overthrow the power of the Pope, which he believed must be destroyed before Italy could ever become a united nation. King Victor Emmanuel did not feel that he could allow this expedition of Garibaldi's, and sent his own army against him. Garibaldi was defeated, and he himself was taken prisoner, but after a short confinement he was pardoned and set at liberty. In 1866 he started another revolution, but was again defeated and again captured. Once more, however, he was pardoned and allowed to go back to Caprera, where he was guarded by a warship to prevent any further activity on his part. 3 years later he offered his services to the French Republic, and was made a deputy of that famous body, the French Versailles Assembly. He then entered the Italian Parliament, and for his great patriotic services was given a pension for life. In later life he married again, but the marriage was not a happy one and was annulled after a number of years, when Garibaldi again took a wife, a peasant woman named Francesca. He died in 1882 at Caprera, one of the most famous of all Italians, and the one to whom modern Italy owes more than to any other man. Had it not been for Garibaldi's great endurance under the most terrible hardships and privations, and his great resolute determination to free his country, there might well be no modern Italy as these pages are written. End of chapter 22. Giuseppe Garibaldi.